Email concerning fieldwork schedules and stuff. So I'm guessing, if what I understand, there shouldn't be any geographers or jog-jol people in the room. Is that correct?
They're all away.
Yeah, that's what I thought. But am I right in thinking the majority of people in here are going to be here next week? Is that correct? Right. Okay. Sorry? If you want, well, no, you see, this is entirely up to you, okay? Well, no, I'm being serious, because originally I said there wasn't going to be a lecture next week. There wasn't going to be a lecture next week, because at the start of the year I understood there was going to be a lot of field work next week. But as it turns out, only the geographers are away. So what I've arranged is we're going to be doing another session on exercises for the calculation questions. Okay, so the plan is next week we're not going to cover any actual kind of content relevant to the essay style question work. It's going to be for the calculation style work. Now, for those of you that want to come in next week, not going to force you, but for those of you who want to come in next week, I've arranged to do some calculation work. It won't be me giving it. It'll actually be James Dorsey doing it. So if you want to come in, it's for your benefit. I would just like to add that the overwhelming majority of requests I get for help with preparing for the exams are for the calculation questions. So if you want to come in, it's there for your benefit. That said, I'll also be posting the material online for the benefit of those that won't be here, because I understand the geographers won't be back for then either. Okay, sorry?
How long is the field trip?
The field trips vary depending on which module you're doing, but they all occur at different times. So but it changes year to year as well. So can you imagine it's a bit complicated trying to run this module around so many different programs? You see what I'm saying? Okay, so that's that. In terms of the coursework, I'm in the process of marking all the first assignments. If all goes well, I should hopefully be able to release the marks by the weekend. If not, very shortly within the weekend, I'm hoping. So you should have those, and the feedback will all be in line on Turnitin. And the second assessment, that is going to be released after this lecture finishes. So now you'll have a very easy timescale to do that on. That is in the form of a Blackboard test. The format of this is you're going to be assigned a number of papers that will be downloadable. These are papers from the peer-reviewed literature, and the theme is you need to be able to extract relevant data that is relevant to the questions being asked from these papers. There will be instructions given. Hopefully it's fairly straightforward for you. I will not be giving any direct help with this particular exercise, although as usual, if there is something that you find unclear about the question in terms of the wording or something, I can try and clarify. Or if you have any questions about the lecture material, I can clarify that as well. But I will not be helping with the actual questions themselves. You're on your own for this one. The idea is you're supposed to take the papers away and extract the information yourself. It is an open book test though. Okay, finally, there will be one more lecture after the Easter break. Because of the way the field work and the Easter holidays fallen this year, we've just got this one lecture on its own. The format of that one is going to be a revision style lecture, and what I'll do is post something a bit nearer the time where people can request anything they would like to see covered in that lecture. As I say, normally the thing most commonly requested is help with the calculation style questions, help with the maths and so on. But that's not the only thing I get asked for. So if there's anything else you would like to get covered in that session, I would encourage you to respond to the notice that I'll put out in due course. Okay, is there any questions about any of that? Or am I free to carry on with today's lecture? No? Okay. So, format of today, I'm going to be covering the phosphorus cycle, but that will not be that will not take up the entirety of the 2-hour slot. Remainder of the time, I was planning on spending on doing an exercise. This one taken from a textbook. Okay, so today's learning outcomes. This is just for the phosphorus cycle component. Apply the different chemical properties of phosphorus, its forms and reservoirs and key processes to the flux. That's very similar to the other chemical cycles. Again, describe the effects of changes to the phosphorus cycle, in particular eutrophication. I'll be covering eutrophication in a little more detail this one. Detail the human uses of phosphorus, perturbations to the phosphorus cycle that result, and the methods to mitigate these effects. Okay, so, as with all the other chemical lectures, start with the periodic table. I'm going to ask the same question I asked before. What forms of phosphorus can you name that's relevant to the Earth system science? Yep. Phosphate. Yep.
Phosphoric acid.
Phosphoric acid. Yep. Can anyone think of any others? No? Oh, that's good because it's a trick question because there aren't any others. Not really. Reason is, phosphorus is a bit of an interesting one compared to the others we have here. Now it's interesting because it is much more chemically reactive than the other elements that we've been dealing with. You can expect to see elemental nitrogen, elemental carbon, elemental sulfur within the Earth system. You do not ever get elemental phosphorus within the Earth system. There's a few kind of exceptions in very exotic volcanic eruption situations, but they never hang around for that long. An upshot of this was it was actually relatively late on in the history of science that phosphorus was actually isolated. It's actually, I find it's quite an interesting story, this, because it was isolated in the 17th century, just when we were just at the cusp of when we were starting to get the modern scientific discipline that we now know as chemistry. And the likes of Boyle were coming along and so on. At the same time, you still had these old school alchemists. And this was one guy, Hennig Brandt, who was like one of the last kind of big alchemists to exist. He was doing what alchemists do, which was trying to find the philosopher's stone, like the substance that can be used to turn lead into gold. And but what he did do is he managed to, by boiling down urine and subjecting it to a few other things, he was able to isolate phosphorus. Now, quite why he exactly felt it necessary to boil down urine and stuff, I think, is another question. But he can take credit for coming up with this substance that glowed, and he gave it the name phosphorus, meaning light-bearing in Latin. So you can imagine his excitement where he thought he might be onto something there, but unfortunately it didn't turn lead into gold, so it wasn't quite as good as he thought. But part of the reason phosphorus in its elemental form glows is that's actually yes?
So if I... You don't want to hear it, never mind. Never mind. Yeah, if I boil my own...
No, not quite. There was a load of... if you want to look it up, the story is retold many times. It subjected it to a few different stages, and some of them are a lot more disgusting than boiling them down, I can tell you that. But the exact recipe, for a while he kept secret because he didn't want to hand it out to anyone. Eventually he sold the recipe because he was getting a bit skint because he was doing all this gold chasing. And then what they did is they managed to refine the technique and actually do some proper chemistry with it eventually. But if you want to look up his actual recipe for getting phosphorus from urine, feel free to look it up on the internet. It's freely available. I wouldn't recommend trying it though. Anyway, so yeah. He thought he was onto something. He was onto something, just not something you can use to make gold. Part of the there is a kind of a semi-serious point to this. Is part of its reactivity though, when it will just react with oxygen in the presence of air. Certainly white phosphorus, which is the form that he did, that will just glow white. It's a chemiluminescent reaction. So that is it just burning in the air and giving off this white glow. But this reactivity means that it does not stick around in the Earth system for very long if it's ever in its elemental form. You can make this form called red phosphorus, which is a little less reactive, but it's not a natural form. You only get that by heating white phosphorus in an inert environment. So any of the phosphorus you see in the Earth system is in the form of some form of phosphate, right, which is its fully oxidized form. Now this is oxidation state 5, and you can see that all of these forms of phosphate, it is surrounded by oxygen. So, so there's all these forms here. This is the phosphate ion. Here is phosphoric acid, which is just phosphate but with a bunch of hydrogens added. And then you can also have biological forms of phosphate, which is pretty much the same as the phosphoric acid, but instead of one of the hydrogens, you've attached an organic molecule to it. All of the times we talk about phosphorus, in Earth system science, pretty much talking about forms of phosphate. Sometimes you'll also hear it referred to as orthophosphate, which is one phosphorus in forming a phosphate. That is to distinguish it from polyphosphate, which we'll get onto in a sec. But to talk about I'm going to start with the different reservoirs of phosphate. I'm going to start with the lithosphere, as I've done with a few other forms. The overwhelming majority of phosphate in mineral form is in the form of apatites. Now, apatites are basically, it's a crystalline structure formed from calcium and phosphate ions, but for every 10 calciums and 6 phosphates, you need an additional ion in order to complete the crystal structure. And in most minerals, that's either fluorine, hydroxy, or chloride. So that gives you 3 different types of apatites, which is fluorapatite, hydroxyapatite, and chlorapatite. However, these are not minerals in their own right. They're entire classes of minerals, because this is a very kind of weakly bound crystal lattice, this. And so it's normal to get a lot of substituted ions in there. The examples are given here, like sodium, sulfate, magnesium. There's a whole bunch of others that are potentially in there. And in terms of the kind of phosphate budgets, they're not that important in terms of the burden, because these are just a few kind of substitute ions here and there, but they can affect the solubility and therefore the weathering rates. So sometimes it is important to consider. The remaining 5% of phosphate minerals, these are these kind of what you call secondary minerals. So that's where there's been some weathering taking place, but then it's kind of substituted back into a mineral. So we've got examples here called vivinite and struvite. There's a whole bunch of other different ones here, but this is normally where phosphate has bound onto a different mineral ion and normally form these hydrate complexes. And then, as well as existing in a mineral, phosphate is also soluble, and it also exhibits a similar behaviour that I've exhibited for the other chemical cycles. So when I've talked about carbonate buffering, also with nitrate and sulfate in solution, phosphate behaves the same way, where it changes the type of ion or the type of molecule that's in solution based on the acidity of the solution it's in there. So if you put phosphate in a completely alkaline solution, it will make these phosphate ions, but then if you put it in a completely acidic solution, it will form phosphoric acid, and then all the different pHs in between, it will form these other forms of phosphate ion, depending on the pH. This one's really important to consider with phosphate because this affects the solubility of phosphate, but it also affects how it forms complexes with other ions. So as well as joining up with hydrogen ions in solution in response to pH, it'll also join up with metal ions as well. So you can also form these complexes here. So magnesium, calcium, sodium. There's another calcium one there where there's hydrogen in there as well. This is important because, first of all, we'll get onto the effects of this, but also the applications of this in a bit. But what this has the effect of doing is it will take these metal ions out of solution by binding to them. But it also means that if these metal ions exist on a particulate or a mineral surface that it's exposed to, it can also bind to it that way, and then that will take the phosphate out of solution. So in the presence of certain metals, then the phosphate will precipitate out. But again, this is pH dependent. If you've got a soil or a sediment that contains phosphate bound to it, and then you increase the acidity of the water, so put some sulfuric acid or nitric acid in there, then that will make the phosphate more soluble and more likely to be released. So there's a lot of complex processes that affect how available phosphate is when it's in solution. Okay, and then we get on to how phosphate in biology. So as with all of the chemical, as with all of the elements that we've talked about in this lecture module, completely vital to life as we know it. Out of all the ones we've discussed so far, though, phosphorus isn't one of the ones more common in biological molecules. So, for instance, generally speaking, for every 10 atoms of nitrogen you have in biomass, you'll have about 1 atom of phosphorus. But there are some very specific things that phosphorus is used for. This is one molecule here, ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Now you'll notice it's got, where it says triphosphate, that's got 3 of these phosphates joined together. They're still only bonded to oxygen, but you'll notice the oxygens are also bonded to other phosphoruses. That's what you call a polyphosphate. So a phosphate can kind of join up and you can get multiple phosphates. That's distinct from orthophosphate. This one's a really important molecule in biology. It's often referred to as the energy currency within cells. So what you can do is this molecule can actually store and release energy by making and breaking these bonds. And then this is what's used to carry energy around cells as part of an organism's metabolism. This is going on the kind of really fine scale. Another thing that phosphate is present on, it forms the backbone of DNA and RNA. So you'll all be familiar with you'll all be familiar with how important DNA is to life. So you have all these amino acids that encode the DNA, but it's like phosphate forms the sides of the ladder. That's what the encoding is attached to. There's also other things that it's useful for, so phospholipids, cell membranes, also teeth and bones. That they form from calcium and phosphate, much in the same way that apatites are. So, as I say, vital to all life forms. How does it get into the biosphere? It's actually relatively easy for the biosphere to take up phosphate, providing it is in solution. So plants, producers, they will quite happily take up phosphate, providing it's soluble and they can take it up into their roots. So of course you can have a plant and it could be surrounded by phosphate, but if that phosphate is bound to the soil, it can't access it, then it can't utilise it. There's a lot of very complex processes that go on involving like soil microbes, fungi and so on, that can actually make conditions more favourable for accessing the phosphorus, so they can use it themselves, but then that can be then used by the plants. And that can be done by making the soil more acidic and so on. So, and then of course, much like other things, consumers such as ourselves, we let a load of other things do the legwork for us. We can get enough phosphate that we need just by consuming the material from the producers. And then what goes in has got to come out somewhere. So when you excrete, both feces and urine will contain phosphate. So hence extracting phosphorus from urine. Also, if an organism dies, or if there's any litter fall or anything like that, much like nitrate, much like nitrogen, it can be remineralized, converted back into phosphate, ready to go straight back into the biosphere. So much like the nitrogen cycle, phosphorus can get very readily reutilised by the biosphere. And so you get these huge fluxes to and from things like the biosphere and the pedosphere. So one of the contexts that you see phosphate discussed a lot in is when it goes into waterways. As I say, it's soluble, but it also subject to some other processes. One similarity between the phosphorus cycle and the carbon cycle is that will also behave according to a biological pump effect. Now, this is true in the oceans. Also true if you've ever got a lake that isn't particularly turbulent and during the summer when it's being heated from the top, is you can have if you have a thermocline set up, so all of this warm water collects at the top and there isn't much mixing. There isn't much vertical mixing within the body of water. So most of you get all this production going on at the surface, but then if you ever get any dead organisms, any pellets, fecal pellets, anything like that, these will contain phosphorus and they will fall under gravity much like the carbon. Now, it can get remineralized further down, but that means that you tend to get this collection of phosphorus towards the bottom of these bodies of water when you have a thermocline like this. Obviously, if you're in a more turbulent body of water, so if you're in a river and it's constantly sloshing around, that will be a much better mix than this. But then also, when it does go to the bottom, recall that phosphate can bind to solid surfaces. So it will bind to soil in the pedosphere. It will also bind to sediments in rivers and oceans as well as being in the sediments as they fall. So to summarise everything that I just said, I'm going to refer to this diagram here, which is going to get added to later. The overall phosphorus cycle that you have, if you just to talk about a start and end process, what we have here is the beginnings of this kind of phosphorus cycle, weathering and erosion. So if we have it all starting in the form of rocks, mainly apatites, and then something happens to mobilize them. So normal process would be something like chemical weathering. And then this gets into, and it's transported by water, so if it gets into a river or something, well then it also binds onto soils and it can be used by the terrestrial biosphere. So we have this addition from the weathering. We get lots and lots of interchanges within the terrestrial biosphere and also within lakes. We can also have a lot of cycling within the lakes, so within the sediments in the lake. But then all the while it's going downhill, being carried by rivers, until ultimately the only place left for it to go is the ocean. So this is kind of like a very basic snapshot of what you would call a phosphorus cycle. One thing to note is that unlike most of the other cycles that I'm giving you, there isn't a kind of a closed loop here. What we're seeing is a starting point, which is your weathering, and an end point, which is the ocean, and then all that happens is a kind of transit as it goes from one end to the other. Now, that's not to say that the ocean's sediments and so on can't end up as minerals in the long run, but we're talking very long time scales there. And so, certainly in terms of the time scales that we care about, we tend to think of the ocean as an end point. Of course, it isn't that simple in that there are ways in which animals can disrupt that. Normally, you would kind of think of a phosphorus cycle within the context of a given river basin, but animals can move the phosphate around for us, and they can move it from one catchment area to another, but they can also move it upstream. So this is taken from a paper that was a few years ago. Should have put the reference on there, that's bad form. But this is showing what kind of fluxes you can get simply by animals animals being free to roam around, eat in one place, move to another, and then either be eaten by another animal, or defecate, or die and leave corpse somewhere. So we can see here, so terrestrial herbivores. These are animals moving around. They can move upstream into different catchment areas. Fish that go upriver, so a fish can grow in the sea, go upriver, and then transport some phosphorus that would have been in the sea further upstream. Seabirds, they catch fish, but they can do the business on land, and thereby transporting phosphorus from the sea. And then you've got deep ocean predators that come back up to the surface, like whales. And then what's also interesting with this paper is they're also looking at what changes in the fauna would have to these fluxes, and they're actually quite significant. So they looked at the human impact, so getting rid of certain animals, making them making less of them, like whales and so on, but also reducing the amount by which animals can roam as well. That changes the fluxes because it means you can't move from one catchment area to another. But they also compared to prehistoric fauna as well. So when you had things like mammoths, these giant ground sloths and so on, without putting too fine a point on it, these animals were remarkably good at defecating. And they were very good at moving phosphorus around. If you've got fewer of these large animals, you have fewer of these large fecal transports, shall we say. So, one of the important forms of phosphate, I was talking about rivers and the sediments and so on, also for the pedosphere. As I say, the phosphate has to be soluble to be available, and it's about 95% of the phosphate within these systems, like river systems, soil systems. 95% of it is bound to a solid and not available to, something's got to make it available. 60% is bound onto mineral particles, so you like your apatites or your other secondary minerals. Rest organic particulates, so basically some particulate organic matter that has yet to be remineralized. So, as I say, acidic conditions, that promotes chemical weathering, and then that releases soluble phosphate, but then you can also form these secondary minerals downstream of that. And then another effect is that when these river sediments, they can be washed out to sea, but then as soon as they end up being exposed to seawater, you introduce a load of other ions into the mix, and they can actually also promote the solubility of phosphate. So that's a mechanism by which you can get a load of phosphate release in river estuaries when you get this seawater coming in and out. And then there's one important perturbation to all of this that human activity has caused. Most of the human perturbations to the phosphate cycle we'll see normally about adding phosphorus, but this is one example where it's actually taken it away. And that is building dams. Example here is the Hoover Dam in America, and this is also an example where they reckon they've actually measured this effect taking place, where you build a dam. What happens here is that holds up this sediment which would normally be washed down the river. So the dam in itself doesn't directly perturb the amount of dissolved phosphate in the river, but it does ultimately mean that the downstream river will have less sediment, and therefore that's less phosphate that could potentially dissolve again. What that means is the impact of building the Hoover Dam means that the Colorado River downstream of that has become more phosphorus limited. So this is an example where human activity actually reduces the phosphate availability. So, as with so many things in this lecture module, once we've got all the information, what do? We make a diagram. So this diagram taken from one of the recommended textbooks. Now this is just giving the kind of, I know most phosphorus things you kind of tend to think of individual river basins, but this is just taking the world as a whole. So we've got our minerals here and sediments. Now you can see here we've got the these sediments here, 4 times 10 to the 6 gigatons phosphate, but you'll notice that the fluxes are absolutely tiny in most of these fluxes, certainly compared to some of the other cycles that we've been looking at. So you compare these fluxes to, say, the carbon cycle fluxes, you'd think, well, you know, why do we even need to care? But of course, worth remembering that life doesn't need as much phosphate as it does carbon. Things I would draw your attention to, the biggest fluxes. Most of these fluxes you're dealing with kind of like, you know, 0.02, 0.0031, that kind of thing. The biggest fluxes, so about 0.1 gigatons phosphate per year, they're the ones involving the biosphere. So the biosphere taking up phosphate or giving it back. So both in the land system and in the ocean system. Even though the actual reservoirs themselves, the burdens, so we've got a burden of 3 gigatons phosphate in the land biota, but then, you know, which is, compare that to the amount that you have in sediments, it seems absolutely tiny. But also comparing to the amount that in soils and rivers as well is actually quite small. Right, now based on what I said earlier, can anyone see something that seems really odd in this whole diagram? So, I mean, one of the things I perhaps did not emphasise enough was there is no gaseous form of phosphate we need to worry about. Yeah? Yeah? Or no? No? Yeah? Yeah, exactly. Why is there an atmospheric burden? What form do you think the phosphate could be in the atmosphere? Sorry? Aerosol, yeah. Anything in particular? Where do we think it's coming from? Yeah, but I mean, where do you think it's? What's the source of it? Volcanoes? Industry? Anything else? No, I mean, yes, but I mean, one of the big things that you can get, of course, is if you've got minerals and soils, if it's present in soils and minerals, you can also have wind-blown dust. So if you get a big enough dust storm, that will whip phosphate up into the atmosphere. But you've got to ask yourself, though, if you look at these fluxes, and you look at the burden there, even compared to some of the smaller burdens and fluxes we're talking about, the burden is absolutely tiny, and the fluxes to and from are also incredibly tiny as well. So you've got to ask yourself, why do we even need to bother considering it? Now, but this comes back to the idea of transport as well, because normally, without the effect of, say, animals, phosphate would remain contained within a particular catchment area. This becomes important when you have a river basin that doesn't happen to have much in the way of phosphate minerals. So in a natural environment, now a big example of this would, say, be the Amazon rainforest, where it's fairly deficient in phosphate minerals, but it is remarkably good at recycling phosphate. So you don't need to feed much in there, but you do need to feed some in there. And one of the main routes in there is this phosphate arriving on the wind. And that can be from somewhere far away as the Sahara Desert, blowing dust across the continents. This is also important for the open ocean as well, because obviously if you're in the open ocean, there isn't a source of phosphate mineral there, so you may need to have a source of phosphate. Now, of course, if you're close to a coast, you have all these rivers transporting all this phosphate from the land, but out in the open ocean, you need a source from somewhere. And if it's not from animals and things, then one of the main routes in there would have to be the atmosphere. That's not to say, as I was saying earlier though, the open ocean, it is normally nitrogen limited, but there are a few regions of the world's oceans that they reckon are phosphorus limited. And the other interesting thing is that the trends in atmospheric phosphorus are actually increasing slightly. We reckon that most of that, they reckon, is actually from increasing biomass burning. So if you have biomass burning, you will get a lot of fly ash, and that will contain residual phosphorus from the windborne. That will contain residual phosphorus from whatever it is it's burning. I should also add there's a few other sources as well. So spores, pollen, they're biological particles. They'll contain phosphorus, so they're actually a source of phosphorus as well. So, and then also within the cycle, moving on to what happens when it gets to the ocean. Basically, as I said before, the end point for the phosphorus cycle is forming a sediment. The majority of the sink of phosphorus in the oceans actually occurs within the continental shelves, where you get the majority of the biological activity taking place. You will get particulates forming that contain phosphate, so your fecal pellets and other biological matter and so on, and eventually some of that will end up descending to the ocean floor, much like the carbon, and then it will accumulate there. Also as well, phosphate will bind to solids and things like hydrothermal vents and stuff. Much like sulfate, you can form precipitates in very hot conditions from the calcium. It's an interesting thing here where there was, this is just an example of the application of this type of analysis in biogeochemical cycling, is trying to look at the burdens of phosphorus in the oceans versus the sources in the sinks. This paper, they tried to do as good a job as they could of comparing the sources and sinks, and they found that they were out of balance. So that means they reckon there was more phosphorus being deposited on the ocean floors than there was going in from rivers and so on. What they took home from this, obviously, if your sinks are greater than your sources, that means your burden must be going down with time. So the concentration of phosphorus in the oceans must be decreasing over time. What they posited was that they reckon that the oceans must have had a load of phosphate released in them at the end of the last ice age, or during the last ice age. So when you had the deglaciation, you had a load of meltwater. That just basically, and a load of the material that would have been physically ground off the rocks, that just basically dumped a load of phosphate in the Earth system, and it's been steadily accumulating on the ocean floor since, and this whole time the phosphorus concentrations have been going down in the oceans. So I suppose the idea might be if you had another round of significant geological activity, then you would perhaps charge the system up again. So that covers the main processes for the kind of the phosphorus cycle. What I'm going to be talking about now, I'm going to be kind of segging on to the anthropogenic role within the phosphorus cycle. But first of all, kind of dealing it from a more natural perspective, but then moving on to human perturbation and the effects. One of the most significant things we need to consider when looking at phosphorus in the Earth system is the effect that it has on producers. So, as I was saying earlier, the two most common limiting factors in primary production tend to be either nitrogen or phosphorus, or sometimes both. Now, this is one of the, I've popped up this figure again. This is Liebig's barrel again. This is something they cottoned onto during the agricultural revolution, and worked out the mechanisms by which fertilization worked. And so they very quickly worked out that if you wanted to get high crop yields, then you needed to keep supplying your plants with phosphorus. And common traditional forms of fertilizer, things like manure, bone meal, guano, that's this example, that's where you have accumulated droppings from bats or seabirds or things. That's a very good source. That is where you have this accumulation of feces that in a particular system, like in a cave or so on. Or you can even grind up phosphate-containing minerals and apply them directly to the soils. The reason you have to do this is, unlike the nitrogen cycle, you can have nitrogen limitation in your crops as well, but you can always choose crops that can fix their own nitrogen, like say soybeans, whereas you can only add phosphate. And of course, as people have got better at growing things, they've come up with artificial ways of producing phosphate fertilizer. And that is from this, basically short-circuiting this whole kind of chemical weathering route. Start out with an apatite, crush it up fine, and then digest it in sulfuric acid. That produces phosphoric acid, because this is the acid displacement, sulfuric is the stronger acid. Leaves you behind some gypsum and some hydrofluoric acid. And then this process, you can just take some mined apatites and produce phosphoric acid, which you can then use to produce your phosphate fertilizers on an industrial scale. So much like nitrogen, we then have to ask the question, well, okay, putting all this extra fertilizer in, is that going to be a bad thing? And the answer is yes, it can be a bad thing. So I mentioned this a few times already with eutrophication, almost certainly covered in a lot of other lecture modules as well. But the way I've kind of defined it here is that where you've got the overabundance of nutrients such that it does something to your ecosystem that you don't want it to do. Classic example is that all of a sudden you find it too easy to grow algae types that you don't particularly want in your ecosystem. Now, can be caused by over-fertilization locally within a system, but also pollution as well. So an unwanted byproduct. And as I was saying, most of the systems in the Earth system tend to be nitrogen or phosphorus limited. So we quite often consider the nitrogen cycles and the phosphate cycles in tandem in this regard. And the reason is that quite often nitrogen pollution and phosphorus pollution, as I'll get onto in a bit, quite often you will find them both together. So what happens if you have a system that is nitrogen limited, then you put a load of nitrogen pollution in there, and then at the point where it would become phosphorus limited, you find that you've also got a lot of phosphorus pollution as well. So if you have nitrogen pollution and phosphorus pollution in tandem, you can have a lot of eutrophication, you can get a lot more production that way, and quite often it's not production that we want. Another term which I should introduce as well is this concept of critical load. So this is used a lot when people talk about regulating eutrophication, when they're talking about having too much nutrients available. That is the point at which, up to a certain amount you can get a bit of eutrophication and the ecosystems can handle it. But then once it hits a certain value, then this is this critical load. That's where you can have things like the wrong type of algae taking over, and you can have ecosystems reaching a tipping point and be affected. And one of the most common things that you see eutrophication being talked about is in river systems, and by extension coastal systems. So with phosphorus, nitrogen and sulfur, a lot of the end point of any pollution is ending up in the hydrosphere. So it can be, if you have over-fertilized land, you will get runoff, and that ends up in the water table and into rivers and so on. If the nitrogen cycle, if you get any deposition from the air, same with the sulfur cycle, that will get rained out, or kind of dry deposition, but ultimately that will get washed down into rivers, streams, and estuaries, and that is where basically all the problems tend to accumulate. One of the most common symptoms of this, there's a couple of pictures there, you can find lots more on the internet because it's happened lots and lots of times around the world, is when you get these blue-green algae blooms. Not particularly welcome for a number of reasons. They'll produce toxins as a byproduct, so you can poison other organisms. Increases the turbidity of water, so not as much light gets through, so that means you don't get any production underneath the surface. And also by changing the ecosystem, you can also introduce hypoxia, where it uses up all the oxygen in the water, and then that means you're unable to support animals like fish in the river as well. And it doesn't just affect rivers, also affects coastal areas where the rivers empty out into, and also entire seas. So, you know, areas like the Baltic, Black Sea and so on, which are very contained, they can be affected as well. So, generally speaking, a bad thing. Right, now, again, I'm just going to ask anyone who's downloaded this PowerPoint, please don't look ahead. I'm going to try and get a discussion point here. I bet you're all looking at it now as well, aren't you? Right, okay. As I was saying, we quite often consider nitrogen and phosphorus together when we're looking at pollution management for rivers and so on. Now, this example is taken, this is from a European level report and looking at pollution in the River Danube. The River Danube is particularly interesting because it's got a huge catchment area, but it takes pollution from multiple countries, but ultimately it all ends up in the one place. So it becomes a real international issue over where the pollution is coming from, where's it going to, and who's affected by it. Now, this is just a figure taken from a budget of where they think the nitrogen and phosphorus are coming from. So, what can you tell me about these two budgets here? If I ask you to just compare nitrogen and phosphorus, according to this figure, what could you, and spot the difference, what could you say? And do not be afraid to point out something obvious. Yeah? Yeah, there is about 10 times as much nitrogen as there is phosphorus. Now, living beings contain about 10 times as much nitrogen as phosphorus, so that ratio isn't a complete accident. But, you know, so even though they're both causing the problems, the actual amounts of nitrogen are much bigger. Okay, anything else you can observe? Yeah?
That the proportion of phosphorus that is point diffuse sources from settlements, so like from housing, or residential areas, is far bigger than nitrogen.
Yes. So a bigger chunk of it, 53% as opposed to 27%, is from settlements. Can anyone think what those sources might be? Yeah? Sewage, yeah. That's, yeah. Yeah, detergents, but they will be in the sewage. You know, so you're both right, is what I'm saying. Can anyone observe any other differences? What's the other big difference between the two? Yeah?
There's a lot more nitrogen coming from other diffuse.
Yeah. And thinking back to previous lecture, what do you think the other diffuse source might be? Anyone remember? All right. So what sphere is important for the nitrogen cycle that isn't important for the phosphorus cycle? Sorry? Atmosphere, yeah. You can get deposition of nitrogen from the atmosphere. So this is talking about ammonia, nitric acid and so on, which are pollutants. They can find their way into the rivers from the atmosphere through wet and dry deposition. Now you'll also notice the fraction from agriculture is kind of similar. Again, that's not accidental. For crops, you want this balance of nitrogen and phosphorus. So it stands to reason that the runoff is going to have a similar recipe for just kind of life in general. And then you've got a kind of a background, which is going to be your weathering and so on, natural sources. So, oh yes, and the other thing I should have pointed out is the background for both of these is about on the order of 10%. So that's saying that 90% of the sources are anthropogenic. So much like the nitrogen cycle, the perturbation to the phosphorus cycle by human activity is absolutely huge. So this is just summarising what I've said, and I think that's covered all we've said. Now, I'm just conscious that we've reached the normal halfway mark. There's a bit more than half a slot's worth of material for the phosphorus cycle. So I'm just going to ask you now, do you want me to carry on with this and we have a break when I finish the phosphorus material, or do you want a break now and then we pick this up in 10 minutes? Break now? Break now? Okay, so it's now 10 to. If we come back in 10 minutes and then we'll finish off the phosphorus cycle and then move on to the exercises, okay? Well, this is not those two equations, this is all of the equations. So it's, these are like, if you take all of these equations, look at what's going in versus what's coming out. Yeah? It's not just those two. Those are the two steps. The reason I highlighted those are the steps involving NOx, if you see what I mean. But these are all just kind of intermediate kind of radicals. But as I say, this is the important bit where you take the, you start with a VOC, and VOC and NOx, and then you end up with kind of byproducts. You keep your NOx, but you produce ozone in the process.
What does
Nitric oxide.
Nitric oxide.
Well, yes, but the reaction wouldn't happen unless you had nitric oxide. So without the nitric oxide, this reaction wouldn't take place. So it's recycled in the process. It's not quite the same as a catalyst. The definitions are slightly different, but it promotes the reaction, yes. A catalyst is something that doesn't participate in the reaction. This does participate in the reaction. This participates in a number of reactions, but it kind of gets recycled. So it's, how can I say, it's not quite a catalyst, I should say. Not using the definitions of a catalyst, but it behaves like a catalyst, I suppose. I suppose the other thing is that this will only take place in sunlight because you need this process here to return the NO2 back to NO. The peroxy radicals, yeah. It's not just hydrogen peroxide. You can have organic peroxy radicals as well. They will also. That's one of those. So on the example there, it's now bearing in mind that this level of detail is not kind of examinative, but that example there is the methyl peroxy radical here. So this reaction there is very fast. So that produces, goes from the methyl peroxy radical to the methoxy radical. Yeah? And in the process of doing that, it converts NO to NO2. Yeah.
These two reacts also convert NO to NO2.
Yeah. But in converting NO to NO2, that means there's more NO2 available to produce ozone from light. So it's not, that's why I say it's not a catalyst, it's a kind of a cyclic reaction. Yeah.
I don't know this is just the reaction between all the...
Yeah, it's a complicated web of reactions. The main point, this is a simplification of what's an incredibly complex process. But the main point is you have all these kind of cyclic reactions, going on around here. But the main thing is that the whole point is that in the process of having all these reactions, you are producing ozone the whole time you have these reactions taking place. They're all taking place at the same time, yeah. You know, I mean, so at any one time in a polluted atmosphere, you'll have all of these things present, doing all these. And of course, this example here is just methane. As I stressed last week, the only reason we put methane there is because that's a relatively simple molecule. In the real atmosphere, methane is actually quite unimportant for this process. The really important ones are the much bigger VOCs, which react a lot faster. So, you know, the bigger the molecule, the faster it reacts. Yep. Hi.
If you're doing the math stuff, are you able to do it on the projectors?
Yes. Well, I was going to give it a go.
Yeah.
It's also for the benefit of the people that aren't here as well.
Yeah.
If I set it up right, hopefully it'll be. In fact, I'm going to give it a quick go now while I'm. See if this works. Excellent. Yep. Okay, so short answer is yes, I will be doing it.
Is that maybe if I get MO2 is more, it's just like potential ozone? Is this reaction correct or wrong?
No, that one was covered in an earlier one. Hang on. There is a reaction. I think that one is right. Yeah, I think that one. Oh no, HO2 plus. Yes, you're right. There it is. Yeah.
So if I have NO2, so if NO2 to have this sunlight, it can be
convert
into MO and
ozone.
What's that? Ammonium nitrate. What is this chemical?
Ammonium nitrate. That's on the next slide, if I recall. NH4NO3. Yeah, that's ammonium nitrate.
So when the deposit directed to surface is dry deposition.
Yeah.
Why is that dry deposition?
Well, because it doesn't involve rain. So ammonia as a gas will stick to things. That is dry deposition. Nitric acid as a gas will stick to things. That's dry deposition. A large particle will just fall under gravity and settle on the ground. That's another example of dry deposition. Dry deposition is any form of deposition that doesn't involve rain or snow, or you know what I mean.
One more question. So what does that mean displacing nucleic acid?
Well, you have nitric acid, and then a weaker acid will leave. So in this example here, you start out with sodium chloride, you add nitric acid, you get sodium nitrate and hydrochloric acid.
So which is the stronger acid?
Nitrate. Yeah.
This is stronger. This is weaker.
Yeah. I'll turn that off for now. Okay. Go on. Got a few more minutes.
So with NR is reactive nitrogen.
Yes. Okay. Then the last one, because I need to start it.
I can't understand what
That's depth inside a body of water. So that is your phosphorus concentration, that's your temperature. Yeah, so it's warmer at the top, you get a thermocline, but the phosphorus concentrations are suppressed, and you get the higher phosphorus concentrations lower down.
the pink here?
Phosphorus.
I know. It is in front.
It's increasing at the lower depth. So this is the surface of your body water. And as you go down,
Yeah.
that's high phosphorus, low temperature, high temperature, low phosphorus. That is literally all the figure means.
Oh.
Yeah? Okay, can we start again now? Okay, can start again please? Right. I've had this back, I'm just assuming that everyone's had the barcode reader. If not, I'll be taking it back at the end of this session. Okay. Right, so now we're on to the anthropogenic uses of phosphate. So we've got all this extra phosphate in the system. I mean, I've already said that it's used as a fertiliser and you get runoff from the fertiliser, but there are other applications as well. So we've already had one example said, which is the detergents. There's other things as well. Preservatives. It's quite often used as a firming agent in meats and fish and so on. It's used in raising agents. It's also used as an ingredient in food. Also, your colas, like Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola. One of the biggest flavourings in Coca-Cola is phosphoric acid. That kind of gives it a sour flavouring. So there's all these sources of phosphate in our food. The overwhelming majority of people, though, it doesn't matter if you have too much phosphate. It doesn't do any harm. You just end up passing it out your system again. It's got the application in detergents. Now, in detergent terminology, it's used. It's referred to as a builder. The purpose of that is to trying to take metal ions out of solution. That's also referred to as softening the water. Two reasons you want to do that. First of all, if you have a lot of metal ions in the water, like calcium and so on, these will interfere with the actions of the detergent. And that's if you're ever in a hard water area and you form a lot of scum when you try to use soaps or detergents, that's what's going on there. So your phosphate is a way of countering that. The other one as well is that calcium is the mechanism by which mud stains as well. That forms these bonds between fabrics and clays. So if you can get rid of the calcium, then that means the mud stain will come off easier. And it does this by forming these metal ion complexes in solution and taking it out. Another use of phosphate to remove metal ions is also if you ever want to get rid of metals from drinking water. Now, one of the big applications in the UK is we still have a certain amount of legacy pipework in the UK that's made from lead. Now, at some point they eventually realised that making drinking water pipes out of lead was a bad idea because lead's toxic. But rather than rip up all the old piping that's in a lot of domestic homes and so on, what you can do is add a bit of phosphate to the water and that will take the lead out of solution. But then better than phosphate for all of these applications is this thing called polyphosphate. Now, gave an example of it before. It's still a phosphate, but this is where the oxygens within the phosphate can bind to each other rather than forming phosphoric acid or something. One example, sodium tripolyphosphate. That's used in a load of the applications that I talked about. So you can use it as a food ingredient, you can use it as a builder, whatever. The reason it's so effective, what it does, is that rather than just the one phosphate ion binding onto the metal ion, you can have all three of them bind onto the metal ion at once. So it kind of wraps around the molecule wraps around the metal ion, and that's a process that's called chelation. And that is much better at removing these, that's much more efficient at removing these metal ions from solution. Of course, there's a slight disadvantage. I should also say, sorry, the phosphonates are another example of this. So this is where you have these phosphates joined onto an organic molecule with a nitrogen in the middle. And you can see there that these phosphates are even freer to kind of bend around each other. This is an even more potent chelating agent than the tripolyphosphate. But as I was saying, the disadvantage of this approach is that ultimately these don't stay as polyphosphates for long. when they get into the hydrosphere. What happens is that eventually you get this reaction taking place, whereby these bonds will hydrolyze, they'll separate, and what you get is for every one tripolyphosphate molecule, that means you get 3 orthophosphate molecules when this goes back into a river system or so on. And we were talking about earlier the phosphate in sewage. Now this is an interesting attempt at budgeting for phosphate in sewage. This is looking at the UK. This is from a paper. It's a bit old now. It's about 5 years old. This budget will have almost certainly changed since this paper was published. So don't take these numbers to the bank. But what's interesting here is that they've chosen to budget the sewage from human waste, not just in terms of urine and feces, but they've also assigned a big chunk now to food additives. Now what they don't mean is this food additives are going straight into sewage. What they're saying is that this is how much extra phosphate that you have in the system because of food additives. So this is how much extra phosphate there is from flavourings, preservatives, etc., that you get in your sewage that you wouldn't have done if it was just food without these additives. But you can see, so we've got a big chunk here, 30%. That's from urine. So urine is very rich in phosphorus. That was where it was first isolated from. We've got the feces there as well. You can see the food additives have got they are a big chunk of what goes into sewage. I personally think Coca-Cola's probably got a lot to answer for on that one. Auto dishwashing and laundry detergents. These are our detergents there. Now I'll get on to in a second why I expect if you did this again, that these might be a little smaller. Tap water dosing. That was what I was talking about earlier when you put phosphate in tap water to try and take metals out, like lead and so on. Food scraps, any bits of food that end up, so, you know, washing off your dishes and so on. And then finally, 1% personal care products. That's actually mainly from toothpaste. Toothpaste normally contains sodium monofluorophosphate, and the reason it contains that, as I said before, teeth are basically the same kind of structure as appetites. You have fluoride toothpaste. That's because of fluorapatites. Helps you to build up calcium, form this structure, but also the phosphate helps that uptake as well. Oh yeah, 7% of sewage phosphorus is non-domestic, so surface water, commercial, industrial, but the majority of it is domestic, from domestic sources. So, okay, so in theory, if you're just putting a load of raw sewage into the rivers, that would be a really bad thing, not just for phosphate, for nitrate as well. So there's a lot of things that are done to try and reduce the amount of phosphate in sewage. One of the first things you do with sewage is, if you take sewage effluent, one of the first things you do is you put it in a settling tank. All the solid material settles out. If you recall, in the Earth system, one of the endpoints of phosphate is in sediments, so it's effectively replicating that. And then you can subject it to some other treatments, but then even once it's done the settling, what you discharge is going to have an amount of phosphate removed. But you can also look to try and reduce it further. One example here is removal of phosphates from detergents. And as I said before, that paper was in 2013. That was just as they were phasing out phosphate in laundry powder, in laundry detergents. So that one should be a lot smaller now. And they've also since then, that came into effect in 2017, is phasing out phosphate in dishwasher tablets. The reason the dishwasher was phased out later is it's actually harder to replace the phosphate in dishwasher tablets. Traditionally, there used to be about 30% phosphate, which is a lot. So they've had to come up with other molecules to replace those with. But as of a couple of years ago, the phosphate's been phased out using these alternative chemicals. So the sources in the previous graph, these two here, these detergents, those at least should be a lot smaller now. You can also enhance the removal from the effluents as part of sewage treatment. One of the things you can do, phosphate will bind to metals. If you take some very reactive metals, say iron or aluminium, if you just put iron or aluminium powder in your effluent, the phosphate will bind to that like crazy and form a precipitate, will form a sediment. But you can also do this process called enhanced biological phosphate removal, where what you do is you subject it to a succession of aerobic and anaerobic bacteria, so it has to alternate between these different tanks. But what that will do is that through each cycle, more phosphate will get assimilated and then more material will settle down. And then that comes with the, so that leaves behind this material known as sludge. The usual practice for dealing with sludge is actually to dispose of it in landfill, which you might think is a bit of a shame. It is possible to recycle that as a fertiliser. It can be a bit difficult if you've used metals to take it out because they tend to have impurities that you don't want in your fertiliser. But certainly the biologically removed phosphate, you can convert that to struvite, extract it, and then use that as a fertiliser again. In theory, you can also just take the raw sludge and use that as a fertiliser. Some places do that, but then you have to worry about all the things that are coming with it. Normally, if you put something into sewage, it's because you don't want it. So you've got to worry about certain things like organic pollutants, pathogens, in particular E. coli, which you get in feces. And another one as well, bizarrely enough, is tomato seeds. Sewage sludge actually contains a lot of viable tomato seeds. And I've known of individuals that have had this problem with tomatoes sprouting where they don't want them to. And also, I should say, they're not as big a contribution, but the industrial agricultural effluents, they are also subject to similar treatments and regulations and so on. And then the final point is that if it does ever get into river systems, remember that the majority of the phosphate within a river system will be in the form of sediments. So you can actually remove phosphate by just physically removing the sediment. So if you dredge if there's a particularly tarnished river, what you can do is dredge it, and that kind of shortcuts getting the phosphate out. So that can be used in remediation as well. And in comparison to some of the kind of gloomy pictures with some of the biogeochemical cycling, what we can say, certainly in the developed world, in places like Europe in particular, is the problem of phosphorus pollution is actually being mitigated over the years. So this is looking at the 1990s. You can see countries like the UK, Germany, Poland. We've actually been seeing improvements in the phosphorus load within rivers. So this certainly within the developed world, this is, as far as river systems are concerned, generally speaking, we've seen improvements. Of course, this isn't true of all of the world. Lots of other locations, this is a steadily increasing problem and something we need to keep an eye on. So, going back to this figure, starting out with our kind of natural unperturbed system, one of the first things we do with the phosphorus is, I'm going to put all of the anthropogenic processes in this box up here. We're taking the phosphate minerals, making them into fertilizers, and then that goes back into our biosphere and our pedosphere. So what happens is we increase the flux from the lithosphere into the biosphere stroke pedosphere, but of course all this phosphate has to end up somewhere, and a lot of it enters into rivers in the form of runoff. And that increases concentrations in the pedosphere, in the hydrosphere, in lakes, and then ultimately the amount that's discharged to the ocean. But then, of course, not all of the phosphorus in the biosphere ends up going this way. Some of it is turned into food. But then also we have our food additives as well. all goes into the food, but then all of that ultimately ends up as sewage, and then that ultimately ends up in our river systems. And then finally we have our detergents, also adding to our sewage, again ending up in our river systems. Of course, just to remind you, the one exception to all of this, all of these processes here, they all add to the phosphorus cycle. The one that changes it in the other direction is dam building. Now, I must stress that most of these considerations, these all tend to be, rather than being a global cycle, people tend to consider the phosphorus cycle within individual river catchments and so on. So, one catchment, you may get a particularly rosy outlook for the phosphorus cycle. In another area, it may be decreased. On another area, it may be increased. And I'd just like to finish off. As I was saying before, the kind of phosphorus cycle, it's not a closed system. One of the things that people have begun to worry about, at the moment we've got, we're using these apatites to produce fertiliser, but like any mineral, we are possibly faced with a finite resource here. And of course, once the phosphorus ends up becoming a sediment on a continental shelf, it's not as easily utilisable. So, begs the question, will we ever run out of phosphorus? Now, what we're doing, much like there's the term peak oil for running out of oil, people have used the term peak phosphorus. Now, this graph here, let's just say I didn't get that from a peer-reviewed paper. This is kind of a slightly, shall we say, less rigorous scientific resource. But people trying to predict exactly how much phosphate there is out there as a mineable resource versus how much we want to use. And there's people coming up with these various predictions about exactly how much phosphate there is left in the world. Now, this is subject to a big debate. Is it something we need to be worried about? Maybe. I mean, certainly there are some countries that restrict the international trade in phosphorus because it's a finite resource, so they want to hold on to it themselves. So this is perhaps something that needs to be considered for a future outlook. You also need to worry, so it does beg the question, if we do start running out of mineable phosphate, what can we do? Should we be recycling phosphates more? Should we be changing farming practices? Should we be changing the crops that we grow, the ones that can utilise phosphate more efficiently? It's an interesting question. Okay, so with that, I think that takes us to the end of the phosphate cycle lecture. We've got about half an hour left for the exercises. Before I move on to those, does anyone have any questions concerning what I've just talked about? No? Okay. Right, now, okay, so I had a request if I could use this projector for showing diagrams. I was planning on doing that anyway for the benefit of the people aren't going to be here. So I hope they'll be listening in due course and that they can hear me okay. Okay, so the exercise that I picked for this afternoon, I'm not going to go through the entire thing, at least I don't think I will. But the idea is that I want a bit of interaction going in it. Now, this exercise is available on Blackboard under the lecture material thing, but I only released it as this lecture started. But it's not something completely out of the blue. This is actually taken from one of the recommended textbooks for this course. This one's from Schlesinger, from chapter 4. If you want to go into this one in more depth, this textbook is available in the library, and it is also available electronically in the library as well. So you're free to, you should have access to the entire thing. But I'll just be focusing on this. Now, I think I'm going to switch this one back in, because for the benefit of those looking on a podcast, it's the left-hand screen that's recorded, at least I hope it is according to the instructions, so if all I can see is the right-hand screen, I'm going to apologise now. Okay, so these are the questions. They're not about a cycle. Certainly the first question is not about a chemical cycle that I'll be testing you on regarding the chemistry. However, this is a good exercise in budgeting and the maths that we're going to be doing. So, problem 4.1. Consider a forested watershed in which evapotranspiration removes about 50% of the annual rainfall and there are no losses of water to groundwater. A scientist makes the following observations. So we've got precipitation, stream water, bedrock. Diagram the magnesium cycle in this system, expressing the inputs and outputs in terms of kilograms per hectare per year. Assuming all these measurements are accurate, how might you explain the small discrepancy the scientist encounters in the budget for magnesium? Right, first part of the question. Diagram the magnesium cycle. Right, as I keep stressing, for these types of problems, first port of call, always advisable, draw a diagram, even if the question doesn't ask you for it. It helps. Okay, so what I'm going to do is let you work on this for 5-10 minutes, and then we'll go through the solution together. Okay, so start by drawing a diagram, and then we can go on to the actual budgeting as well. Okay, I'm not expecting you to have finished it all, but if we were to draw a diagram, where should I start? Yeah? Bedrock. Sorry? Yeah. So, just checking I'm on here. So, okay. So, bedrock. Any other reservoirs we need to consider?
The catchment.
Yeah. So what's that in? So, yeah. So if we just call it the catchment, so that's all the magnesium contained within the catchment area. Do we need to consider any other burdens, any reservoirs? Yes or no question. What do you think? No? No. Yeah, the rest are fluxes. So, fluxes. Sorry? Weathering. Okay, so weathering. Okay, what other fluxes do we have?
Runoff.
Runoff, where does that go from to?
From the catchment outside body.
Out the system, yeah. So that's just a sink. So we've got our runoff, so that's stream water. Any other fluxes? Yep. Deposition, precipitation, and where's that going from to? Yeah. Well, yeah.
Just from outside the system.
Yeah. So we're not considering the atmosphere as a reservoir. This is just okay. So on that note, if I was to assign variables to these, so I'm going to call, just to follow convention, I'm going to call my sources Q and my sinks S. That's not enforced, providing you can call them whatever you want so long as they're defined. It's just convention to call them Q and S. So our source Q1, another source Q2, stream water S1. Okay. Now burdens by convention call M. So catchment M1. Now we've decided to include bedrock, call that M2. Okay, so there's our diagram. Can we assign values to any of those? Or do we have to do calculations for any of those numbers? There is one, what I should also stress here, there's a ever so slight deviation from how I've introduced these problems most of the time. The burdens and the fluxes are normally done as masses or mass per unit time. This question here specifies that you have to do it in terms of a mass per unit time per area or mass per area. So everything here has to be per hectare. Okay? So Other than that, it's just the same convention. Yes?
Why don't we use the evapotranspiration as a flux as well? Is that not perfect?
Right, what we are considering here is the magnesium cycle.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Now, the evapotranspiration is important. We'll get on to why that is. But in terms of the magnesium, when the water evaporates, it leaves behind the magnesium. So we don't consider it. Yeah? Okay, so what I'm going to... Now, all of these numbers here, I'm going to say this now, though. We cannot assign a value to M2 for this problem. Reason is, well, we have a flux from weathering from the bedrock. We aren't equipped with the numbers that we've been given to actually work out the burden of the bedrock in this problem. But for the purposes of the magnesium cycling within the catchment, it's not actually important to know what this M2 is. So I thought I'd tell you that now, so when you're working on it, you don't need to worry about it. Okay, so what you need to do, expressing the inputs and outputs of in terms of kilograms per hectare per year. That is basically quantifying these three variables here, which is Q1, Q2 and S1. So if I give you 5 minutes on that, have a crack at it, and then we can talk about how we might calculate these. Great. Right. If someone feels they have one of the answers, feel free to stick your hand up and we can work through it. If you're still working on it though, go right ahead. Yep.
So for stream water, you times like the volume per year times the concentration.
Yep.
By 1,000 to get kilograms.
Right, so the volume is the 1.81, so 1.5 times 10 to the 8 litres per year.
Yeah.
Yep. So that's, and then,
Times by 0.4.
so times 0.4, and what was the last bit you said?
And then so you convert it from milligrams to kilograms.
Yeah.
Actually, no, it's not thousands, isn't it? Millions.
So you, what,
Divided by a million.
divided by a million? Yep. So what I'm going to put here is times 10 to the minus 6. Right, so looking at the units we have there, that gives us, so we have 1.5 times 10 to the 8 litres per year and 0.4 times 10 to the minus 6 kilograms per litre. Then that gives us units of actually I'm getting ahead of myself here. What's this number? Someone with a calculator handy, just quickly rattle this. Sorry? So, beg your pardon, sorry? 60, 60. 60, just 60. Yep. Kilograms per year. Now, that is correct as a flux. The only bit there is the question asks it to be expressed as kilograms per hectare per year. So there's an additional step in the calculation there. Now, this is one of these situations, I should explain. This is one of these situations where you're trying to get a quantity out of some kind of disparate data. And you've got all this information in front of you. There is more than one way of doing this calculation and getting at the same answer. Okay? Now, just to give you a small clue, one of the things we need to be looking at is this figure here. 50% of the annual rainfall is removed by evapotranspiration. So in these kind of situations, if you ask to, what they've not given us is the total land area that we need to divide this by to get our units per hectare. But there is a way of getting at that number somehow. So the weathering rate, that has the units of kilograms per hectare per year. I would say yes. Unfortunately, that isn't quite the spirit of the question. I'll just draw your attention where it says, assuming that these measurements are accurate, how might you explain the small discrepancy the scientist encounters in the budget for magnesium? What we're trying to do is compare magnesium leaving the system versus magnesium entering the system. If we use that weathering rate, we are basing our sink on one of our sources. And what we'll do is we'll find that we don't have a discrepancy. But, you know, that is a good idea, though. Yeah?
Isn't there something that says that if the precipitation amount is 1,000 millimetres per year, that's the same as 1,000 litres per square metre per year?
Yeah.
So could we somehow link that?
Yes. So, as I was saying, we've got 50% of the annual rainfall is lost through evapotranspiration. So where does the rest end up? Yeah, stream water. So this is actually moving the budget onto a different substance, but using this we can actually work out Yep.
Sorry, I'm a little bit confused because you said that when the water evaporates out, it leaves the magnesium in the stream, but now
Yeah.
it sounds like...
No, right. I'm talking about the system as a whole. So, ignoring the magnesium for a second. Yeah? Talking about our water now. We've got water in versus water out. Now, what was said earlier is we have 100 centimetres per year precipitation of water. That gets us an amount of water per hectare per year going into the system. Now, if we can say half of that is leaving in the form of stream water, that we can say is the amount of water per hectare per year as stream water. Does that make sense? Well, okay. So if I move this on, so if I just go off to the side, talk about our water cycle. So if we have going in, so that's 100 cm per year. Okay. Now, if I was to try and convert that into litres per year per hectare, how would I do that? Off the side there, sorry. So the target is to get from 100 centimetres a year to, I want units of litres per hectare per year. Yep.
So it's 1,000 millimetres per year, and that's the same as 1,000 litres per square metre per year, and then you need to times it by 10 to the 4th to make it into per hectare.
Right. So we go through those steps. We go so multiply by
10 to get millimetres first.
So if we go, I'll start with the centimetres per year times 10. That gets us to millimetres per year. Yep.
Yeah, and that a millimetre, I think so. A millimetre per year is the same as litres per square metre. Is that right?
So a square metre is 1,000 millimetres by 1,000 millimetres,
Yeah.
and you multiply that by 1 millimetre, so that gives you 1,000,000 cubic millimetres. Really messes with your head, this, which is the same as 1,000 cubic centimetres, which is the same as a litre. So yeah, so that is the same as, what did you say, what were the units again, did we say? That was litres per
Square metre.
year.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then,
What did we end up
yeah?
with? Sorry, Nancy?
Oh, oops, sorry, thanks for pointing that out. I think all the geographers will thank you for that as well.
So we have 1,000 litres per square metre per year. Is that right?
Well, hang on, I'm just saying, how do you, there's another step where you're trying to get to litres per hectare per year.
We times it by 10 to the 4th, I think.
Times or, yeah?
Wait, I'm not sure.
Well, if you've got 1 litre per square metre per year, how many will you have in a hectare?
10,000.
Yeah. So yeah, the answer's right. Then that will get you litres per hectare per year. Yeah, so we've had to multiply by 10 and 10 to the 4. So that in total multiplied by 10 to the 5. Answer is so 100 multiplied by 10 to the 5. Yeah, so 10 to the 7 litres per hectare per year.
And then that means that in the stream water we'll have 5 times 10 to the 6. Is that right?
Yeah, so that's going in. So we've got going out. So 50% evap. It's like 5 times 10 to the 6. And stream water, 5 times 10 to the 6 again. Right, so that has given us a stream water flow of 5 times 10 to the 6 litres per hectare per year. Does everyone understand where we got that number from? No?
Just about.
Just about? And I just see that we're nearly out of time as well, actually, but I think it's important to get this one. Okay, so does everyone understand where we got this from? Converted from centimetres per year to litres per hectare per year. Do we need to go through that step again? Right. If we just ignore the per year bit for now, if you imagine a centimetre of, if you imagine 100 centimetres of rain falling, yeah? So we have an area covered with 1 metre of water. Yeah? Then what you can do is if you take that depth of 1 metre of water and then cover 1 hectare with it, then that gets you the total volume, that gives you the volume of water per hectare. So 10,000 cubic metres. Right, anyway, and then we need to convert that volume from cubic metres to litres is another way of looking at it. But if you imagine you've got 1 hectare of land that you've covered to that depth of water, and you have to work out how many litres you've got in that 1 hectare of water that's covered by that depth of water. That's going through those steps there. So we've gone from 100 centimetres a year, we've gone to 1,000 millimeters, which is same as saying 1,000 litres per square metre. So if you've got 1 metre depth of water over 1 square metre, 1 metre by 1 metre by 1 metre, you can fit 1,000 litres into that. That's another way of looking at it. So for every square metre, so there's 10,000 square metres. There's 10,000 square metres in a hectare. So if you multiply the number of litres per our kind of cubic metre by number of square metres in a hectare, that gets us our number of litres in a hectare of land for that amount of rainfall. And so if you're getting that amount of rainfall per year, that is the amount of rainfall per year expressed as litres per hectare. And then we can take that number, if we say half of it isn't going into the stream water, we just halve it, and then we can use that as our units of stream water. And I'm just going to go straight on because I realise we've hit time. But going back to this equation here, if we were to then take our concentration and then instead multiply that by our 5 times 10 to the 6, and again our 10 to the minus 6 to get the unit conversion right. So we're going from milligrams to... sorry, I've just realised I've multiplied the wrong number there. Ignore what I just did then. So we're taking our new flow, which is 5 times 10 to the 6, which is expressed as... so that's expressed as our litres per hectare per year. Multiply that by our concentration. Then this will get, so these two cancel out, so 5 times 0.4 is 2 kilograms per hectare per year. So does everyone follow where this one comes from? So instead of expressing our river flow as litres per year, we've expressed it as litres per hectare per year. And that way we're fulfilling what the question is asking. Right, because we've actually hit time now. I mean, I can stick around for a couple of minutes, but I'm sure you all want to leave. I've not gone into the rest of this question. If you would like, I can... if you'd like, what I can do is post a solution, certainly to this question, along with the material, as I say, is already on Blackboard. You've also got access to the textbook if you want. To go back to the other questions, these other two questions involve getting details from tables. You've got to extract the details from the tables and get the appropriate numbers. That is, I'll leave that as an exercise to do yourselves if you want. That final question 4.4, that one you've got to delve into the chapter of the textbook to get the relevant data out of. That one I'm not... you can do it if you want, but that's not as much of a fun exercise. The other two questions, I'm providing you with the relevant tables here. Okay, so as I say, next week it's going to be more calculation exercises. For those of you who are not going to be here, those will be available on Blackboard with the solutions after the fact. And as I say, next week it will be James Dorsey. And then I will be seeing you next after Easter for the revision lecture. So thank you. Right.
So can I take a picture of